Translators Preface. There are three objectives in translation of works of this character: to give a faithful, literal translation of the author's statements, to give these in a manner which will interest the reader, and to preserve, so far as is possible, the style of the original text. The task has been doubly difficult in this work because, in using Latin, the author availed himself of a medium which had ceased to expand 1,000 years before his subject had in many particulars come into being. In consequence, he was in difficulties with a large number of ideas for which there were no corresponding words in the vocabulary at his command, and instead of adopting into the text his native German terms, he coined several hundred Latin expressions to answer his needs. It is upon this rock that most former attempts at translation have been wrecked. Except for a very small number, we believe we have been able to discover the intended meaning of such expressions from a study of the context, assisted by a very incomplete glossary prepared by the author himself, and by an exhaustive investigation into the literature of these subjects during the 16th and 17th centuries. That discovery in this particular has been only gradual and obtained after much labor, may be indicated by the fact that the entire text has been retypewritten 3 times since the original, and some parts more often, and further that the printer's proof has been thrice revised. We have found some English equivalent, more or less satisfactory, for practically all such terms, except those of weights, the varieties of veins, and a few minerals. In the matter of weights, we have introduced the original Latin, because it is impossible to give true equivalents and avoid the fractions of reduction. And further, as explained in the appendix on weights, it is impossible to say in many cases what scale the author had in mind. The English nomenclature to be adopted has given great difficulty, for various reasons. Among them, that many methods and processes described have never been practiced in English-speaking mining communities, and so had no representatives in our vocabulary, and we consider the introduction of German terms undesirable. Other methods and processes have become obsolete and their descriptive terms with them, yet we wish to avoid the introduction of obsolete or unusual English. But of the greatest importance of all has been the necessity to avoid rigorously such modern technical terms as would imply a greater scientific understanding than the period possessed. Agricola's Latin, while mostly free from medieval corruption, is somewhat tainted with German construction. Moreover, some portions have not the continuous flow of sustained thought which others display, but the fact that the writing of the work extended over a period of 20 years sufficiently explains the considerable variation in style. The technical descriptions in the later books often take the form of house that Jack built sentences, which have had to be at least partially broken up, and the subject occasionally reintroduced. Ambiguities were also sometimes found which it was necessary to carry on into the translation. Despite these criticisms, we must, however, emphasize that Agricola was infinitely clearer in his style than his contemporaries upon such subjects, or for that matter than his successors in almost any language for a couple of centuries. All of the illustrations and display letters of the original have been reproduced, and the type as closely approximates to the original as the printers have been able to find in a modern font. There are no footnotes in the original text, and Mr. Hoover is responsible for them all. He has attempted in them to give not only such comment as would tend to clarify the text, but also such information as we have been able to discover with regard to the previous history of the subjects mentioned. We have confined the historical notes to the time prior to Agricola, because to have carried them down to date in the briefest manner would have demanded very much more space than could be allowed. In the examination of such technical and historical material, one is appalled at the flood of misinformation with regard to ancient arts and sciences which has been let loose upon the world by the hands of non-technical translators and commentators. At an early stage, we considered that we must justify any divergence of view from such authorities, but to limit the already alarming volume of this work, we later felt compelled to eliminate most of such discussion. When the half-dozen most important of the ancient works bearing upon science have been translated by those of some scientific experience, such questions will, no doubt, be properly settled. We need make no apologies for Re Metallica. During 180 years, it was not superseded as the textbook and guide to miners and metallurgists, for until Schluter's great work on metallurgy in 1730, it had no equal. That it passed through some 10 editions in 3 languages at a period when the printing of such a volume was no ordinary undertaking, is in itself sufficient evidence of the importance in which it was held, and is a record that no other volume upon the same subjects has equaled since. A large proportion of the technical data given by Agricola was either entirely new, or had not been given previously with sufficient detail and explanation to have enabled a worker in these arts himself to perform the operations without further guidance. Practically, the whole of it must have been given from personal experience and observation, for the scant library at his service can be appreciated from his own preface. Considering the part which the metallic arts have played in human history, the paucity of their literature down to Agricola's time is amazing. No doubt the arts were jealously guarded by their practitioners as a sort of stock in trade, and it is also probable that those who had knowledge were not usually of a literary turn of mind. And, on the other hand, the small army of writers prior to his time were not much interested in the description of industrial pursuits. Moreover, in those thousands of years prior to printing, the tedious and expensive transcription of manuscripts by hand was mostly applied to matters of more general interest, and therefore many writings may have been lost in consequence. In fact, such was the fate of the works of Theophrastus and Strato on these subjects. We have prepared a short sketch of Agricola's life and times, not only to give some indication of his learning and character, but also of his considerable position in the community in which he lived. As no appreciation of Agricola's stature among the founders of science can be gained without consideration of the advance which his works display over those of his predecessors, we therefore devote some attention to the state of knowledge of these subjects at the time by giving in the appendix a short review of the literature, then extant, and a summary of Agricola's other writings. To serve the bibliophile, we present such data as we have been able to collect it with regard to the various editions of his works. The full titles of the works quoted in the footnotes under simply authors' names will be found in this appendix. We feel that it is scarcely doing Agricola justice to publish De Re Metallica only. While it is of the most general interest of all of his works, yet, from the point of view of pure science, De Natura Facilium and De Ordo et Causes are works which deserve an equally important place. It is unfortunate that Agricola's own countrymen have not given to the world competent translations into German. As his work has too often been judged by the German translations, the infidelity of which appears in nearly every paragraph. We do not present De Re Metallica as a work of practical value. The methods and processes have long since been superseded, yet surely such a milestone on the road of development of one of the two most basic of human industrial activities is more worthy of preservation than the thousands of volumes devoted to records of human destruction. To those interested in the history of their own profession, we need make no apologies, except for the long delay in publication. For this, we put forward the necessity of active endeavor in many directions. As this book could be but a labor of love, it has had to find the moments for its execution in night hours, weekends, and holidays, in all extending over a period of about 5 years. If the work serves to strengthen the traditions of one of the most important and least recognized of the world's professions, we shall be amply repaid. It is our pleasure to acknowledge our obligations to Professor H.R. Fairclough of Stanford University for perusal of and suggestions upon the first chapter, and to those whom we have engaged from time to time for one service or another, chiefly bibliographical work and collateral translation. We are also sensibly obligated to the printers, Messrs. Frost and Sons, for their patience and interest, and for their willingness to bend some of the canons of modern printing to meet the demands of the 16th century. July 1, 1912. The Red House, Hornton Street, London. Introduction. Biography. Georgius Agricola was born at Glauchau in Saxony on March 24, 1494, and therefore entered the world when it was still upon the threshold of the Renaissance. Gutenberg's first book had been printed but 40 years before. The humanists had but begun that stimulating criticism which awoke the Reformation. Erasmus, of Rotterdam, who was subsequently to become Agricola's friend and patron, was just completing his student days. The Reformation itself was yet to come, but it was not long delayed, for Luther was born the year before Agricola, and through him Agricola's homeland became the cradle of the great movement, nor did Agricola escape being drawn into the conflict. Italy, already awake with the new classical revival, was still a busy workshop of antiquarian research, translation, study, and publication. And through her the Greek and Latin classics were only now available for wide distribution. Students from the rest of Europe, among them at a later time Agricola himself, flocked to the Italian universities, and on their return infected their native cities with the newly awakened learning. At Agricola's birth, Columbus had just returned from his great discovery, and it was only 3 years later that Vasco da Gama rounded Cape Good Hope. Thus these two foremost explorers had only initiated that greatest period of geographical expansion in the world's history. A few dates will recall how far this exploration extended during Agricola's lifetime. Balboa first saw the Pacific in 1513. Cortés entered the city of Mexico in 1520. Magellan entered the Pacific in the same year Pizarro penetrated into Peru in 1528. De Soto landed in Florida in 1539, and Potosi was discovered in 1546. Omitting the sporadic settlement on the St. Lawrence by Cartier in 1541, the settlement of North America did not begin for a quarter of a century after Agricola's death. Thus the revival of learning, with its train of humanism, the Reformation, its stimulation of exploration, and the reawakening of the arts and sciences, was still in its infancy with Agricola. We know practically nothing of Agricola's antecedents or his youth. His real name was Georg Bauer, peasant, and it was probably Latinized by his teachers, as was the custom of the time. His own brother, in receipts preserved in the archives of the Zwickau Town Council, calls himself Bauer, and in them refers to his brother Agricola. He entered the University of Leipzig at the age of 20, and after about 3½ years, attendance there gained the degree of Baccalaureus Artium. In 1518, he became vice principal of the municipal school at Zwickau, where he taught Greek and Latin. In 1520, he became principal, and among his assistants was Johannes Forster, better known as Luther's collaborator in the translation of the Bible. During this time, our author prepared and published a small Latin grammar. In 1522, he removed to Leipzig to become a lecturer in the university under his friend, Petrus Mosellanus, at whose death in 1524 he went to Italy for the further study of philosophy, medicine, and the natural sciences. Here he remained for nearly 3 years, from 1524 to 1526. He visited the universities of Bologna, Venice, and probably Padua, and at these institutions received his first inspiration to work in the sciences. For in a letter from Leonardus Casibrodius to Erasmus, we learn that he was engaged upon a revision of Galen. It was about this time that he made the acquaintance of Erasmus, who had settled at Basel as editor for Froben's press. In 1526, Agricola returned to Zwickau, and in 1527 he was chosen town physician at Joachimsthal. This little city in Bohemia is located on the eastern slope of the Erzgebirge, in the midst of the then most prolific metal mining district of Central Europe. Thence to Freiburg is but 50 miles, and the same radius from that city would include most of the mining towns so frequently mentioned in Re Metallica Schneeberg, Jaer, Annaberg, and Altenburg, and, not far away, were Marienburg, Gottesgab, and Platten. Joachimsthal was a booming mining camp, founded but 11 years before Agricola's arrival, and already having several thousand inhabitants. According to Agricola's own statement, he spent all the time not required for his medical duties in visiting the mines and smelters, in reading up in the Greek and Latin authors all references to mining, and in association with the most learned among the mining folk. Among these was one Lawrence Berman, whom Agricola afterwards set up as the learned miner in his Dialogue Bermanus. This book was first published by Froben at Basel in 1530, and was a sort of catechism on mineralogy, mining terms, and mining lore. The book was apparently first submitted to the great Erasmus, and the publication arranged by him, a warm letter of approval by him appearing at the beginning of the book. In 1533, he published De Mensuris et Ponderibus, through Froben, this being a discussion of Roman and Greek weights and measures. At about this time, he began De Re Metallica, not to be published for 25 years. Agricola did not confine his interest entirely to medicine and mining, for during this period, he composed a pamphlet upon the Turks, urging their extermination by the European powers. This work was no doubt inspired by the Turkish siege of Vienna in 1529. It appeared first in German in 1531, and in Latin, which it was originally written in 1538, and passed through many subsequent editions. At this time, too, he became interested in the God's Gift mine at Abertham, which was discovered in 1530. Writing in 1545, he says, "We, as a shareholder, through the goodness of God, have enjoyed the proceeds of this God's gift since the very time when the mine began first to bestow such riches." Agricola seems to have resigned his position at Joachimsthal in about 1530, and to have devoted the next 2 or 3 years to travel and study among the mines. About 1533, he became city physician of Chemnitz, in Saxony, and here he resided until his death in 1555. There is but little record of his activities during the first 8 or 9 years of his residence in the city. He must have been engaged upon the study of his subjects and the preparation of his books, for they came on with great rapidity soon after. He was frequently consulted on matters of mining engineering, as, for instance, we learn from a letter written by a certain Johannes Hordeborch that Duke Henry of Brunswick applied to him with regard to the method for working mines in the Upper Harz. In 1543, he married Anna, widow of Matthias Maynor, a petty tithe official. There is some reason to believe from a letter published by Schmid that Anna was his second wife, and that he was married the first time at Joachimsthal. He seems to have had several children, for he commends his young children to the care of the town council during his absence at the war in 1547. In addition to these, we know that a son, Theodore, was born in 1550, a daughter, Anna, in 1552. Another daughter, Irene, was buried at Chemnitz in 1555, and in 1580 his widow and 3 children, Anna, Valerius, and Lucretia, were still living. In 1544 began the publication of the series of books to which Agricola owes his position. The first volume comprised 5 works and was finally issued in 1546. It was subsequently considerably revised and reissued in 1558. These works were De Ordo et Causis Subterraneorum in 5 books, the first work on physical geology, De Natura Aerum qui effluent ex terra in 4 books, on subterranean waters and gases, De Natura Facilium in 10 books, the first systematic mineralogy, De Veteribus et Novis Metallis in 2 books, devoted largely to the history of metals and topographical mineralogy. A new edition of Bermenus was included. And finally, Rerum Metallicarum Interpretatio, a glossary of Latin and German mineralogical and metallurgical terms. Another work, De Animantibus Subterraneis, usually published with De Re Metallica, is dated 1548 in the preface. It is devoted to animals which live underground, at least part of the time, but is not a very effective basis of either geologic or zoologic classification. Despite many public activities, Agricola apparently completed De Re Metallica in 1550, but did not send it to the press until 1553, nor did it appear until a year after his death in 1555. But we give further details on the preparation of this work on p. Roman 15. During this period, he found time to prepare a small medical work, De Peste, and certain historical studies, details of which appear in the appendix. There are other works by Agricola referred to by 16th century writers, but so far we have not been able to find them, although they may exist. Such data as we have is given in the appendix. As a young man, Agricola seems to have had some tendencies toward liberalism in religious matters, for while at Zwickau he composed some anti-popish epigrams. But after his return to Leipzig, he apparently never wavered and steadily refused to accept the Lutheran Reformation. To many even liberal scholars of the day, Luther's doctrines appeared wild and demagogic. Luther was not a scholarly man, his addresses were to the masses, his Latin was execrable. Nor did the bitter dissensions over hair-splitting theology in the Lutheran Church after Luther's death tend to increase respect for the movement among the learned. Agricola was a scholar of wide attainments, a deep-thinking, religious man, and he remained to the end a staunch Catholic, despite the general change of sentiment among his countrymen. His leanings were toward such men as his friend the humanist, Erasmus. That he had the courage of his convictions is shown in the dedication of De Natura Eorum, where he addresses to his friend, Duke Maurice, the pious advice that the dissensions of the Germans should be composed, and that the Duke should return to the bosom of the Church those who had been torn from her, and adds, "Yet I do not wish to become confused by these turbulent waters and be led to offend anyone. It is more advisable to check my utterances." As he became older, he may have become less tolerant in religious matters, for he did not seem to show as much patience in the discussion of ecclesiastical topics as he must have possessed earlier. Yet he maintained to the end the respect and friendship of such great Protestants as Melanchthon, Camerius, Fabricius, and many others. In 1546, when he was at the age of 52, began Agricola's activity in public life. For in that year he was elected a burgher of Chemnitz. And in the same year, Duke Maurice appointed him burgomaster, an office which he held for 4 terms. Before one can gain an insight into his political services, and incidentally into the character of the man, it is necessary to understand the politics of the time and his part therein, and to bear in mind always that he was a staunch Catholic under a Protestant sovereign in a state seething with militant Protestantism. Saxony had been divided in 1485 between the princes Ernest and Albert, the former taking the electoral dignity and the major portion of the principality. Albert the Brave, the younger brother and Duke of Saxony, obtained the subordinate portion, embracing Meissen, but subject to the elector. The elector Ernest was succeeded in 1486 by Frederick the Wise, and under his support Luther made Saxony the cradle of the Reformation. This elector was succeeded in 1525 by his brother John, who was in turn succeeded by his son John Frederick in 1532. Of more immediate interest to this subject is the Albertian line of Saxon dukes who ruled Meissen, for in that principality Agricola was born and lived, and his political fortunes were associated with this branch of the Saxon house. Albert was succeeded in 1505 by his son George, the Bearded, and he in turn by his brother Henry, the last of the Catholics, in 1539, who ruled until 1541. Henry was succeeded in 1541 by his Protestant son Maurice, who was the patron of Agricola. At about this time, Saxony was drawn into the storms which rose from the long-standing rivalry between Francis I, King of France, and Charles V, of Spain. These 2 potentates came to the throne in the same year, 1515, and both were candidates for emperor of that loose confederation known as the Holy Roman Empire. Charles was elected, and intermittent wars between these 2 princes arose first in one part of Europe, and then in another. Francis finally formed an alliance with the Schmalkalden League of German Protestant princes, and with the Sultan of Turkey against Charles. In 1546, Maurice of Meissen, although a Protestant, saw his best interest in a secret league with Charles against the other Protestant princes, and proceeded, the Schmalkalden War, to invade the domains of his superior and cousin, the Elector Frederick. The Emperor Charles proved successful in this war, and Maurice was rewarded, at the capitulation of Wittenberg in 1547, by being made Elector of Saxony in the place of his cousin. Later on, the Elector Maurice found the association with Catholic Charles unpalatable, and joined in leading the other Protestant princes in war upon him. And on the defeat of the Catholic party and the Peace of Passau, Maurice became acknowledged as the champion of German national and religious freedom. He was succeeded by his brother Augustus in 1553. Agricola was much favored by the Saxon electors, Maurice and Augustus. He dedicates most of his works to them and shows much gratitude for many favors conferred upon him. Duke Maurice presented to him a house and plot in Chemnitz, and in a letter dated June 14, 1543, in connection therewith, says, that he may enjoy his lifelong a freehold house unburdened by all burgher rights and other municipal service, to be used by him and inhabited as a free dwelling, and that he may also, for the necessities of his household and of his wife and servants, brew his own beer free, and that he may likewise purvey for himself and his household foreign beer and also wine for use, and yet he shall not sell any such beer. We have taken the said doctor under our especial protection and care for our lifelong, and he shall not be summoned before any court of justice, but only before us and our counselor. Agricola was made burgomaster of Chemnitz in 1546. A letter from Fabricius to Mura, dated May 19, 1546, says that Agricola had been made burgomaster by the command of the prince. This would be Morris, and it is all the more a tribute to the high respect with which Agricola was held, for, as said before, he was a consistent Catholic, and Morris a Protestant prince. In this same year, the Schmalkalden War broke out, and Agricola was called to personal attendance upon the Duke Morris in a diplomatic and advisory capacity. In 1546, also he was a member of the Diet of Freiburg, and was summoned to council in Dresden. The next year he continued, by the Duke's command, burgomaster at Chemnitz, although he seems to have been away upon ducal matters most of the time. The Duke addresses the Chemnitz Council in March 1547. "We hereby make known to you that we are in urgent need of your burgomaster, Dr. Georgius Agricola, with us. It is, therefore, our will that you should yield him up and forward him that he should with the utmost haste set forth to us here near Freiburg." He was sent on various missions from the Duke to the Emperor Charles, to King Ferdinand of Austria, and to other princes in matters connected with the war, the fact that he was a Catholic probably entering into his appointment to such missions. Chemnitz was occupied by the troops of first one side, then the other, despite the great efforts of Agricola to have his own town specially defended. In April 1547, the war came to an end in the Battle of Mulberg, but Agricola was apparently not relieved of his burgomastership until the succeeding year, for he wrote his friend Wolfgang Mura in April 1548 that he was now relieved. His public duties did not end, however, for he attended the Diet of Leipzig in 1547 and in 1549, and was at the Diet at Torgau in 1550. In 1551, he was again installed as burgomaster, and in 1553, for the fourth time, he became head of the municipality, and during this year had again to attend the diets at Leipzig and Dresden, representing his city. He apparently now had a short relief from public duties, for it is not until 1555, shortly before his death, that we find him again attending a diet at Torgau. Agricola died on November 21, 1555. A letter from his lifelong friend, Fabricius, to Melanchthon, announcing this event, states, "We lost on November 21 that distinguished ornament of our fatherland, Georgius Agricola, a man of eminent intellect, of culture, and of judgment. He attained the age of 62. He who since the days of childhood had enjoyed robust health was carried off by a 4 days' fever. He had previously suffered from no disease except inflammation of the eyes, which he brought upon himself by untiring study and insatiable reading. I know that you loved the soul of this man, although in many of his opinions, more especially in religious and spiritual welfare, he differed in many points from our own. For he despised our churches, and would not be with us in the communion of the blood of Christ. Therefore, after his death, at the command of the prince, which was given to the church inspectors and carried out by Tettelbach as a loyal servant, burial was refused him, and not until the 4th day was he borne away to Zeitz and interred in the cathedral. I have always admired the genius of this man, so distinguished in our sciences and in the whole realm of philosophy, yet I wonder at his religious views, which were compatible with reason. It is true, and were dazzling, but were by no means compatible with truth. He would not tolerate with patience that anyone should discuss ecclesiastical matters with him. This action of the authorities in denying burial to one of their most honored citizens, who had been ever assiduous in furthering the welfare of the community, seems strangely out of joint. Further, the Elector Augustus, although a Protestant prince, was Agricola's warm friend, as evidenced by his letter of but a few months before CP Roman 15. However, Catholics were then few in number at Chemnitz, and the feeling ran high at the time, so possibly the prince was afraid of public disturbances. Hoffmann explains this occurrence in the following words: "The feelings of Chemnitz citizens, who were almost exclusively Protestant, must certainly be taken into account. They may have raised objections to the solemn interment of a Catholic in the Protestant Cathedral Church of St. Jacob, which had perhaps been demanded by his relatives, and to which, according to the custom of the time, he would have been entitled as burgomaster. The refusal to sanction the interment aroused, more especially in the Catholic world, a painful sensation. A brass memorial plate hung in the cathedral at Zeitz had already disappeared in 1686, nor have the cities of his birth or residence ever shown any appreciation of this man, whose work more deserves their gratitude than does that of the multitude of soldiers whose monuments decorate every village and city square. It is true that in 1822 a marble tablet was placed behind the altar in the church of St. Jacob in Chemnitz, but even this was removed to the historical museum later on. He left a modest estate, which was the subject of considerable litigation by his descendants due to the mismanagement of the guardian. Hoffmann has succeeded in tracing the descendants for 2 generations, down to 1609, but the line is finally lost among the multitude of other Agricolas. To deduce Georgius Agricola's character, we need not search beyond the discovery of his steadfast adherence to the religion of his fathers amid the bitter storm of Protestantism around him, and need but to remember at the same time that, for 25 years, he was entrusted with elective positions of an increasingly important character in this same community. No man could have thus held the respect of his countrymen unless he were devoid of bigotry and possessed of the highest sense of integrity, justice, humanity, and patriotism. Agricola's intellectual attainments and position in science. Agricola's education was the most thorough that his times afforded in the classics, philosophy, medicine, and sciences generally. Further, his writings disclose a most exhaustive knowledge not only of an extraordinary range of classical literature, but also of obscure manuscripts buried in the public libraries of Europe. That his general learning was held to be of a high order is amply evidenced from the correspondence of the other scholars of his time, Erasmus, Melanchthon, Mura, Fabricius, and others. Our more immediate concern, however, is with the advances which were due to him in the sciences of geology, mineralogy, and mining engineering. No appreciation of these attainments can be conveyed to the reader unless he has some understanding of the dearth of knowledge in these sciences prior to Agricola's time. We have an appendix be given a brief review of the literature extant at this period on these subjects. Furthermore, no appreciation of Agricola's contribution to science can be gained without a study of De Ortu et Causes and De Natura Facilium. For while De Re Metallica is of much more general interest, it contains but incidental reference to geology and mineralogy. Apart from the Book of Genesis, the only attempts at fundamental explanation of natural phenomena were those of the Greek philosophers and the alchemists. Orthodox beliefs Agricola scarcely mentions. With the alchemists he had no patience. There can be no doubt, however, that his views are greatly colored by his deep classical learning. He was in fine to a certain distance a follower of Aristotle, Theophrastus, Strato, and other leaders of the peripatetic school. For that matter, except for the muddy current which the alchemists had introduced into this already troubled stream, the whole thought of the learned world still flowed from the Greeks. Had he not, however, radically departed from the teachings of the peripatetic school, his work would have been no contribution to the development of science. Certain of their teachings he repudiated with great vigor, and his labored and detailed arguments in their refutation form the first battle in science over the results of observation versus inductive speculation. To use his own words, "Those things which we see with our eyes and understand by means of our senses are more clearly to be demonstrated than if learned by means of reasoning." The bigoted scholasticism of his times necessitated as much care and detail in refutation of such deep-rooted beliefs as would be demanded today by an attempt at a refutation of the theory of evolution. And in consequence, his works are often but dry reading to any but those interested in the development of fundamental scientific theory. In giving an appreciation of Agricola's views here and throughout the footnotes, we do not wish to convey to the reader that he was in all things free from error and from the spirit of his times, or that his theories, constructed long before the atomic theory, are of the clear-cut order which that basic hypothesis has rendered possible to later scientific speculation in these branches. His statements are sometimes much confused, but we reiterate that their clarity is as crystal to mud in comparison with those of his predecessors and of most of his successors for over 200 years. As an indication of his grasp of some of the wider aspects of geological phenomena, we reproduce, in Appendix A, a passage from De Ortu et Causes, which we believe to be the first adequate declaration of the part played by erosion in mountain sculpture. But of all of Agricola's theoretical views, those are of the greatest interest which relate to the origin of ore deposits. For in these matters, he had the greatest opportunities of observation and the most experience. We have on page 108 reproduced and discussed his theory at considerable length, but we may repeat here that in his propositions as to the circulation of ground waters, that ore channels are a subsequent creation to the contained rocks, and that they were filled by deposition from circulating solutions, he enunciated the foundations of our modern theory, and in so doing took a step in advance greater than that of any single subsequent authority. In his contention that ore channels were created by erosion of subterranean waters, he was wrong, except for special cases, and it was not until 2 centuries later that a further step in advance was taken by the recognition by Van Appel of the part played by fissuring in these phenomena. Nor was it until about the same time that the filling of ore channels in the main by deposition from solutions was generally accepted. While Werner, 250 years after Agricola, is generally revered as the inspirer of the modern theory by those whose reading has taken them no farther back, we have no hesitation in asserting that of the propositions of each author, Agricola's were very much more nearly in accord with modern views. Moreover, the main result of the new ideas brought forward by Werner was to stop the march of progress for half a century, instead of speeding it forward, as did those of Agricola. In mineralogy, Agricola made the first attempt at systematic treatment of the subject. His system could not be otherwise than wrongly based, as he could scarcely see forward 2 or 3 centuries to the atomic theory and our vast fund of chemical knowledge. However, based as it is upon such properties as solubility and homogeneity, and upon external characteristics such as color, hardness, and C, it makes a most creditable advance upon Theophrastus, Dioscorides, and Albertus Magnus, his only predecessors. He is the first to assert that bismuth and antimony are true primary metals, and to some 60 actual mineral species described previous to his time, he added some 20 more, and laments that there are scores unnamed. As to Agricola's contribution to the sciences of mining and metallurgy, De Re Metallica speaks for itself. While he describes, for the first time, scores of methods and processes, no one would contend that they were discoveries or inventions of his own. They represent the accumulation of generations of experience and knowledge, but by him they were, for the first time, to receive detailed and intelligent exposition. Until Schluter's work nearly 2 centuries later, it was not excelled. There is no measure by which we may gauge the value of such a work to the men who followed in this profession during centuries, nor the benefits enjoyed by humanity through them. That Agricola occupied a very considerable place in the great awakening of learning will be disputed by none except by those who place the development of science in rank far below religion, politics, literature, and art. Of wider importance than the details of his achievements in the mere confines of the particular science to which he applied himself is the fact that he was the first to found any of the natural sciences upon research and observation, as opposed to previous fruitless speculation. The wider interest of the members of the medical profession in the development of their science than that of geologists in theirs has led to the aggrandizement of Paracelsus, a contemporary of Agricola, as the first in deductive science. Yet no comparative study of the unparalleled egotistical ravings of this half-genius, half-alchemist, with the modest sober logic and real research and observation of Agricola, can leave a moment's doubt as to the incomparably greater position which should be attributed to the latter as the pioneer in building the foundation of science by deduction from observed phenomena. Science is the base upon which is reared the civilization of today, and while we give daily credit to all those who toil in the superstructure, let none forget those men who laid its first foundation stones. One of the greatest of these was Georgius Agricola. De Re Metallica. Agricola seems to have been engaged in the preparation of De Re Metallica for a period of over 20 years, for we first hear of the book in a letter from Petrus Plotinus, a schoolmaster at Joachimsthal, to the great humanist, Erasmus, in September 1529. He says, "The scientific world will be still more indebted to Agricola when he brings to light the books De Re Metallica and other matters which he has on hand." In the dedication of De Mensuris et Ponderibus in 1533, Agricola states that he means to publish 12 books de Re Metallica, if he lives. That the appearance of this work was eagerly anticipated is evidenced by a letter from Georg Fabricius to Valentine Hurdle. With great excitement, the books de Re Metallica are being awaited. If he treats the material at hand with his usual zeal, he will win for himself glory such as no one in any of the fields of literature has attained for the last 1,000 years. According to the dedication of De Veteribus et Novis Metallis, Agricola in 1546 already looked forward to its early publication. The work was apparently finished in 1550, for the dedication to the Dukes Morris and August of Saxony is dated in December of that year. The eulogistic poem by his friend, Georg Fabricius, is dated in 1551. The publication was apparently long delayed by the preparation of the woodcuts, and according to Mathesius, many sketches for them were prepared by Basilius Weffring. In the preface of De Re Metallica, Agricola does not mention who prepared the sketches, but does say, "I have hired illustrators to delineate their forms, lest descriptions which are conveyed by words should either not be understood by men of our own times, or should cause difficulty to posterity." In 1553, the completed book was sent to Froben for publication. For a letter from Fabricius to Mura in March 1553 announces its dispatch to the printer. An interesting letter from the Elector Augustus to Agricola, dated January 18, 1555, reads, "Most learned, dear and faithful subject, whereas you have sent to the press a Latin book of which the title is said to be De Rebus Metallicis, which has been praised to us, and we should like to know the contents, it is our gracious command that you should get the book translated when you have the opportunity into German, and not let it be copied more than once or be printed, but keep it by you and send us a copy. If you should need a writer for this purpose, we will provide one. Thus you will fulfill our gracious behest." The German translation was prepared by Philip Beccius, a Basel University professor of medicine and philosophy. It is a wretched work, by one who knew nothing of the science, and who more especially had no appreciation of the peculiar Latin terms coined by Agricola, most of which he rendered literally. It is a sad commentary on his countrymen that no correct German translation exists. The Italian translation is by Michelangelo Florio, and is by him dedicated to Elizabeth, Queen of England. The title page of the first edition is reproduced later on, and the full titles of other editions are given in the appendix, together with the author's other works. The following are the short titles of the various editions of De Re Metallica, together with the name and place of the publisher. Latin editions: De Re Metallica, Froben Basel Folio 1556, E 1561, Ludwig Koenig 1621, Emanuel Koenig 1657. In addition to these, Leupold, Schmid, and others mention an octavo edition, without illustrations, Schweinfurt 1607. We have not been able to find a copy of this edition, and are not certain of its existence. The same catalogues also mention an octavo edition of De Re Metallica, Wittenberg, 1612 or 1614, with notes by Johann Sigfrido, but we believe this to be a confusion with Agricola's subsidiary works, which were published at this time and place, with such notes. German editions: Vom Bergwerk Froben Folio 1557, Bergwerk Butch, Sigmundi Farabent, Frankfurt on Main Folio 1580. Ludwig Koenig, Basel Folio, 1621. There are other editions than these, mentioned by bibliographers, but we have been unable to confirm them in any library. The most reliable of such bibliographies, that of John Ferguson, gives an addition to the above. Bergwerk Butch, Basel, 1657, Folio and Schweinfurt, 1687, octavo. Italian edition: Elart de Metalli, Froben Basel Folio, 1563. Other languages: so far as we know, De Re Metallica was never actually published in other than Latin, German, and Italian. However, a portion of the accounts of the firm of Froben were published in 1881, and therein is an entry under March, 1560, of a sum to one Leodigarus Grimaldo for some other work, and also for correction of Agricola's De Re Metallica in French. This may, of course, be an error for the Italian edition, which appeared a little later. There is also mention that a manuscript of Re Metallica in Spanish was seen in the library of the town of Bejar. An interesting note appears in the glossary given by Sir John Pettis in his translation of Lazarus Erckern's work on assaying. He says, "But I cannot enlarge my observations upon any more words, because the printer calls for what I did write of a metallic dictionary, after I first proposed the printing of Erckern. But intending within the compass of a year to publish Georg Agricola de Re Metallica, being fully translated in English, and also to add a dictionary to it, I shall reserve my remaining essays, if what I have done hitherto be approved, till then, and so I proceed in the dictionary." The translation was never published, and extensive inquiry in various libraries, and among the family of Pettis has failed to yield any trace of the manuscript. Footnotes. For the biographical information here set out, we have relied principally upon the following works: Petrus Albinus, Masonisch Land und Berg Chronica, Dresden, 1590. Adam Daniel Richter, Umständlich. Chronica der Stadt Chemnitz, Leipzig, 1754. Johann Gottfried Weller, Alsos Allen Thalen der Geschichte, Chemnitz, 1766. Friedrich August Schmid, Georg Agricola's Bermenis, Freiburg, 1806. Georg Heinrich Jacobi, Der Mineralog Georgius Agricola, Zwickau, 1881. Dr. Reinhold Hoffmann, Dr. Georg Agricola, Gotha, 1905. The last is an exhaustive biographical sketch, to which we refer those who are interested. Georgii Agricoli Glossiae Libellis de Prima AC Simplici Institution Grammatica, printed by Melchior Lothar, Leipzig, 1520. Petrus Mosellanus refers to this work, without giving title, in a letter to Agricola, June, 1520. Brief and Desiderius Erasmus von Rotterdam, published by Joseph Forstemmen and Otto Günther, Roman 27. Beheft zum Zentralblatt für Bibliothekswesen, Leipzig, 1904. p. 44. De Veteribus et Novis Metallis, Preface. A summary of this, and of Agricola's other works, is given in the Appendix A. De Veteribus et Novis Metallis, Book 1. Printed in F. A. Schmid's Georg Agricola's Bermenis, p. 14, Freiburg, 1806. Ob Sit, p. 8. Archive 38, Chemnitz Municipal Archives. Baumgarten Crucius. Georgi Fabrici Chemnicensis Epistoli ad W. Murium et alios equals, Leipzig, 1845, p. 26. Hoffmann op. Sit, p. 99. Weber Verorum Clarorum Seculi Roman 16. Et Roman 17. Epistoli Selecti, Leipzig, 1894, p. 8. Baumgarten Crucius, op. Sit, p. 139. Hoffmann op. Sit, p. 123. De Ordo et Causes, Book 3. Brief and Desiderius Erasmus von Rotterdam, published by Joseph Forstemmen and Otto Günther, Roman 27. Beheft zum Zentralblatt für Bibliothekswesen, Leipzig, 1904, p. 125. Petrus Albinus, Masonisch Land und Berg Chronica, Dresden, 1590, p. 353. This statement is contained under 1556, in a sort of chronicle bound up with Mathesius's Serpta, Nuremberg, 1562. Baumgarten Crucius, p. 85, letter number 93. Principal State Archives, Dresden, Kopp, 259, folio 102. Jacob Leupold, Prodromus Bibliothecae Metallici, 1732, p. 11. F. A. Schmid, Georg Agricola's Bermenis, Freiburg, 1806, p. 34. Bibliotheca Chemica, Glasgow, 1906, p. 10. Rechnungsbuch der Froben und Episcopius Buchdrucker und Buchhändler zu Basel, 1557-1564, published by R. Wackernagel, Basel, 1881. p. 20. Colchen de los Hermanos T93, Fall, 255 en la Acad. De la Hist, Madrid. Sir John Pettis, Flet a Minor, The Laws of Art and Nature and C. London, 1636, p. 121. Georgius Fabricius in Libros Metallicos, Georgii Agricoli Philosophi Priestantissimi. Ad lectorum. Ciuet ignita cognoscere front chimeram, semicanum nympum, semibauum curum si centum capitum titanum, toc ferentum sublimum manibus tela crunta gigen, ciuet etnium penetrare cyclopes in antrum ac alios, vates quos pepperer, metis, nunc placet mecum doctos eulera libros, ingenium agricoli quos dedit acer tibi. Non hic Ioanna tenet suspensum fabula mentum, sed precium, utilitas multa, legentes erit. Quidquid terra sinu, gremioque recondidit IMO omni tibi multis erut ante libris. Siu fluens superes ultro nidater in horas inuniet facilum su magis art uium. Perpetui proprigs manent de fontibus amnes, est grauis albani spont mephitis odor. Lethals sunt spont scrobes dicia chidis ori, et micat e grave media candiditus ignis humo. Plana nariscorum cum tellus arsit in agro ter curia nondum fals resecta series, nec dedit hoc damnum pastor, nec eopiter in vulcani per si ruperat ira solium. Terrifico oraphoras erumpens, incita motu seep facet montes, ant ubi plana uia est. Hic abstrusa cois, emoque incognita fundo cognita natura seep fura duce. Art hominum, in lucem uinient quoque multa, manuc terri multiplices effodienter opes. Lydia sic nitrum profert, islandia sulfur, ac modo tirhenis midit illumin ager, sicina, quatrifido subit equer vistula cornu, piscanter codano corpora seriuasinu. Quid memorum regum preciosa insignia gemmas, marmorec excelsis structa sub astra iuges, nil lapides, nil saxa morer. Sunt pulchra metalla cros tuis opibus clara, midec tuis quic acer macido terra crenit fodit, nomen permittans nomina priscasiu. Et nunc non ullis sedit Germania terris terra ferex hominum, terrec dius opum. Hic ori in uinis locupletibus ora refulgit, non alio messis carrier ulla loco. Oricamum extularit felix campania ramum, nec fructu nobis deficient cadit. Erut argenti solidas hoc tempor massas fosser, de proprigs armec miles agris, ignatum grades est hesperesque metallum, quad by semudum lingua paterna uicat. Candidius nigro, sed plumbo nigrius albo nostra quoque hoc uina diuit fundit humus. Funditor in tormenta, chorus cum imitantia fulmen aes, inc hostels feria massa domos. Scribunter plumbo libri. Quis creditit ant quam mirandum artem tutinus ora dedit, nec tamen hoc aliges, aut illa petentur ob oris eruda Germano cunctum metalla solo. Sed quid ego hic rapido, monumentis tradita claris agricoli, qui nunc docta per ora uolent. Hic causus ordis, and formas euribus addit, et querenda quibus sint meliora locis. Qui si ment prius legisti candidus equa, da reliquis quoque nunc tempora pauca libris, vita lidas sequitur cultorum, creed, euluptas non iucunda minor, rara legentes, erit, eudicio prius ni quis male damnit iniquo, qui sunt octoris munera myriadae, eripit ipsues primum tella hostibus, inc matentes torque spicula rapta caput. Verter equo latro, euhiter parata triremi, ergo necindus equus, nec fabricanda radis, visceribus terri latent abstrusa metalla, vti opibus nescit quad moliturbus sues, quisquis ease, aut doctis pareto monantibus, aut t inter haber bonos ni fader locum. Si non in prarupta metallicus abacit audex, vt quandam emisso curtius acer equo, sed prius edicit, qui sunt nascenda perito, quoque facit, multa doctus ob art facit. Vitique gubernator seruet cum sider juntos. Sic minim dubiges uditer alle notis. Iocides noem, curus regit art mediscus. Fosser opus perigit nec minus art suum. Indaget uni spatium, numerumque modumque, siu obliquus suum recta tendet iter. Pastor et exploret qui terra sit apta colenti, qui beni lanageres, qui male pascat aus, enteri intentis, quid uincula linea tendit fungiter officio eum tolmicu. Vitique sui in unit mensurem iurac uni, in uerios operas dividit into ueros. Iam congressus opus. Ioiden ut mauit omni quad obstat, assidua ut usat strenus arma manu, ni tibi surdescent feri tinitibus oras, ad groira idio conspicienda uni, instrut ex sues nunc artibus alle minors, sedulitas nulli non operosa loco. Materi docet hic uni spatium commodumque, vitique regat positus finibus erua lapis, niquis transmisso uilentus limite purgens, non sibi concesses, in sua vertat opes. Hic docet instrumenta, quibus plutonia regnatutus addit, saxi permeat ac uias. Quanta uides, solidas expugnit machina terras, machina non ullo tempor uisa prius, seed nuis, nulla non inclita laud uitustas, posteritas meritus est quoque grata tuis. Tum quia Germano sunt hic in junta sub ax, si quis ease, inuitii contra hi vela tui. Osinus ora tumit bellis, terra attica cultu, germinum infractus tollit ad astra labor. Nec tamen ingenio solit in feliciter iudi might gerat phobi, su gra martis opus tempus adest, structis uinarum montibus, in explorer, usum quem sibi uniferet, non labor ingenio caret hic, non copia fructu, est adaperta boni prima fenestra spe. Ergo instat poro groyers fair labors, intentas operi nec remower manus. Vir siu locus posket, siu tundir uras, siu lawyer lacu preter untis equi. Su flammis itrum modicis toror nesses est, excoquer aut fastis ignibus omni malum, cum fluit aes riuis, ori argentique metallum, spes animo fosser uix capit ip suas. Argentum cupidus fuluo cessernit ob oro, et plumbi lentem demit utrique morem. Separat argentum, lucri studiosus, ob servatis, linquens deteriora bonus. Quisi cuncta iulum tenui percurre uisu anti alium ruhat memninis orda diem, postremus labor est, concretos desir succos, quos fert innumeris teutona terra locis. Quo sal, quo nitrum, quo pacto fiat illumen, vi sibus artificis comparet illa manus nec non chalcantum, sulfur, fluidunc bitumen, massac quo uitri lenta delanda modo. Suscipit hic hominum mirandos cura labors, pauperium usque idio fair fame gra est, tantus amor iuctum paruis extundir natis, et patricium non dare malum, nec manit in terri fosseris mersa lapris mens, sed fert domino uota procesque dio. Munifici expectat, spi plenus, munera dextra extolens animum letus ad astra suum, divishes Christus dat nodicianc fruendi, cui memori greats pector semper agit. Hoc quoque laudati quandam facere Philippi, qui virtudes habent cum piedate decus, huc oculos, huc flect animum, suicem lector, octorm pia nicido ment diem. Agricoli hinc optans operoso fosta labori, laudibus eximage candidus esto uiri. Illes suum extolit patrii cum nomen nomen, et iur in or frequens posteritatis erit. Cuncta cadent letho, studage monumenta uagebunt, purpure donic lumina solis erunt. Misseni m deli, eludo illustri. Footnotes. For completeness' sake, we reproduce in the original Latin the Laudation of Agricola by his friend, Georgius Fabricius, a leading scholar of his time. It has but little intrinsic value, for it is not poetry of a very high order, and to make it acceptable English would require certain improvements, for which only poets have license. A free translation of the last few lines indicates its complementary character. He doth raise his country's fame with his own, and in the mouths of nations, yet unborn his praises shall be sung. Death comes to all but great achievements, raise a monument which shall endure until the sun grows cold.